Thank you. So I'm here to talk about storytelling. I've got a couple of quotes I want to start with to really underscore the importance of storytelling. Margaret Atwood said that storytelling is an old human skill that gives us the ultimate evolutionary advantage. She says we use them to warn, to unify, to comfort, and to inspire. And that's pretty interesting. Salman Rushdie would say we are storytelling animals by nature. And storytelling's been very important to me throughout the course of my life, but more importantly, in the last 15 years or so, I live or die based on my ability not just to tell a story, but to tell a story that moves an audience from A to B. I got on the lecture circuit after I published my first book, Love is the Killer App, and by 2005, I decided to leave my job at Yahoo and go full-time in a van down by the river. And in the corporate lecture circuit, there's a golden rule. You get invited back if the audience changes behavior when they get home. You can get a standing ovation, you can get a perfect score, but if they do the same thing after conference they did before conference, you weren't effective. So I learned quickly I had to understand storytelling, and fortunately I had a couple of mentors that really helped me think more about it from a scientific standpoint. My first mentor in that space was the person who led to me writing my first book, Love is the Killer App, Jan Miller. She heard me giving a talk when I was working for Mark Cuban back in 1998 in Dallas, Texas, for a group half this size, a real estate group, and all I did was tell a story about how a person couldn't buy a home because of a lack of information. And she came up to me afterwards and said, we're going to do a book together. And when she educated me about writing books, she explained to me that all great books are stories told, and it's an interactive experience, as I'll say over and over again. It is not a broadcast experience per se. And the first thing I want to do in talking about story science is to talk about the purpose of why we tell a story. We must be intentional as storytellers if we want to achieve anything significant. So there's three purposes, she says, in order of success. Third is the helpful story. She says this represents 80% of all attempts, especially in literary nonfiction, to tell stories. We see something, we share a story, it reveals a moral that's helpful, it usually adjusts some behavior in terms of the audience, and she explains, though, that those sell one at a time. They have no viral coefficient, say, from a media marketing standpoint, because people don't have an emotional reaction or connection with them. The second purpose of telling a story, she said, is the idea that we transform people. We confront people. We either transform their behavior or we challenge convention. Books that challenge convention, taking something that we believe and shattering it, are like comedians like Mitch Hedberg that create the awesome punchline at the end of an observation. She says those are way more effective because sometimes they represent the gestalt of a nation. But the most important purpose for telling a story, she taught me, the one that always has the high viral coefficient, is the validation principle. If a story is told to create a sense of connectedness with the audience responds. Later, when I was writing my second book, Likeability Factor, I did a lot of deep research on why we like other people. I had a wonderful opportunity to work with Fremantle on some shows where we tried to predict who had the L factor that would make them appealing, and if they had low talent and could get all the way to the final round, that was the ultimate win for programming. And we learned that likability was the ability for someone to give validation as a gift to others, to teach other people they're not alone. I read something by Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite storytellers. And there's a little book that's published of a conversation that Vonnegut had with Lee Stringer, another fantastic storyteller. And the book is called Like Shaking Hands with God. And it was a conversation in a coffee shop in New York City. Vonnegut was lamenting about the world of video games. He said, people don't care about reading stories anymore. They just want to play games and watch football. He says, but why do we continue to write? He says, we write because we know that there are people out there that desperately need to hear the following message. You are not alone. There's somebody else in the world that sees the world the way you do and shares the values that you hold dear, and you are part of something bigger. And that motivated Kurt, and when I read that, it changed the way I wrote. So Love is the Killer app, and I've got copies in the back, and I'd love to give any of you a book that wants one. Love is the Killer app started out as my personal experience at Yahoo and what I considered at the time my secrets to networking success. But I got my real vision around the book when I met a kid at a bookstore, 25-year-old kid that looked like Greg Brady. I'll date myself here. He was in the bookstore for over an hour, and he bought nothing. I had a stack of books, and I asked him, this is at Christie's, San Francisco, I said, didn't you find anything? And he looked at me, and he said, all these guys that write books are a bunch of old, white, bald guys that are either professors or consultants, and they don't speak my language. No one's written a book for me. So he became the only reason I wrote Love is the Killer app. And the message I wanted to send Greg Brady is that you are successful, not despite the fact that you are a nice, smart person, but because of the fact that you are a nice, smart person. In 2005, I realized that if I was going to be successful in this new career, I'd better understand why stories are important and what the structure of stories really is. And what I learned in research is this very simple idea that if you're trying to move people, that's the business I'm in, and I think many of you are in that business too. You're trying to engage people. You're trying to elicit their imagination. You're trying to light a fire. You got two choices. You can either tell them stories or you can share facts and figures. I know I'm sounding a little bit left, right brain. I actually am more excited about modern research on top and bottom brain, which I'll talk later on about. But the idea here, very simple. People ride stories like a wave. And they resist facts and figures like a stiff wind in the face. Let me tell you why we ride stories. If you research the idea of archetypal stories, so one of my first reading assignments for you is this fantastic book by Joseph Campbell. If you ever want to tell the hero's journey, it's called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. There's another book called The Writer's Journey by Chris Vogler, but I want to get a close-up of this. This is the bomb. And Campbell says that mythological stories have been passed down more than genetic code, and our minds are imprinted to know instinctively a good story that's properly told in the proper sequence, because a story is an account of a sequence of events that leads to a certain place, and then there's the road back. And what Campbell says is that when we hear an archetypal story that's told effectively, and he said every great speech has told the story, our mind knows where the speaker's going, where the movie's going, where the writer's going before they get there, and you had them at mythological. And because they're with you on the story, they relax, and the wall of resistance comes down, and they listen with their whole brain, not just the left, not just the bottom, and they suspend judgment, and they consider alternatives. So this is why I think it's so important to understand storytelling before we think about how we do it in the digital age. So the first thing I learned from my first story coach, Nick Morgan, his website is called Public Words. He wrote a fantastic book called Working the Room. I hired him in 2005 to really help me understand proper storytelling if it was designed to move an audience from A to B. Because a lot of people that we think tell stories, they really just sling bits. They have this little bits, and they tell these bits in a certain sort of way, and there's usually some comedic value or some reveal that's involved with it. But the storyteller, I learned, has to follow a clear map, and that's what Dr. Morgan taught me. So this is the first kind of like takeaway I want to give you today. If you tell a story, it better be one of these 5. Because every great speech, every great movie, every great book, every great digital story followed one of these 5 archetypal stories that are deeply coded into our psyche. We recognize them when we hear them, and we believe them, and when the moral of the story is revealed, we get it. That was one of the greatest things I ever read by George Lucas. He said effective storytelling is the ability to reveal the truth without making the error of trying to define it. And that's when we lean on this structure. So there's 5 of them. There's the hero's journey. It starts with once upon a time. It starts with a problem. It starts with a resistance to the call. It leads to a mentor. It leads to an ordeal. It leads to a conflict. It leads to a climax. It leads to the road back, and then there's meaning. And this is the most popular form of story. I think for a lot of us, we tell the hero's journey. That's what that book is all about, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. For those of you that speak or do presentations, the second book that he got me to read, and this one's it's a must-read for anybody that presents or makes any kind of presentations, is called Resonate by Nancy Duarte. I mean, a shot of this one. This is a must-read. Got it? Yes. She studied every major speech in history that's worth talking about and created a sparkline, a consistent structure to how they told their stories, whether it's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or whether it's Steve Jobs launching the iPhone. And the hero's journey is the typical archetypal story we tell when we're trying to transform people. Give me an example of hero's journey in movie making. Somebody want to shout one out? Star Wars is the one. And that's the one that Nancy Duarte focuses on and resonates because it defines the role of the storyteller. She says the principal mistake storytellers make as creative as ego involvement, where we are the story. We are the mentor. The audience is the mentee. She says it's wrong. If you see Star Wars, Lucas, everyone involved in there, they are the helpful mentor, and the audience is the hero. And that's the ultimate way to think about storytelling and why there were mentors and challenges throughout that type. Second type of story is coming of age. Coming of age is a great story, say, for a CEO that works at a company that's about to get killed by digital innovation. It's a great story about how to wake up and change. And you hear it all the time in corporate. Give me an example of a coming of age story. Star Wars. Excuse me? Catcher in the Rye, fantastic. I also like, from a movie standpoint, Stand By Me. It's another good one. But Coming of Age is a story that usually is a memoir in its structure. Third one is Stranger in a Strange Land, also called Fish Out of Water. Give me an example of a fish out of water story. Wizard of Oz is great. I like to say anything on NBC that's not been canceled yet is Fish Out of Water. But I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Yes, that's a very good one, Wizard of Oz. Love story. We could go on and on about all the different love stories out there, but it also has a particular archetype. And, of course, the Rambo category, revenge. Now, here's the takeaway. I mean, you probably already knew these types of stories. But here's the most important thing I learned from Dr. Morgan. Do not let the backstory crush the story. See, when you tell someone, you got to focus on a story, what's your story? So when I have met with people that are trying to get involved in digital storytelling, the first thing I ask them is, what's your story? When I had my researcher, and I was talking to you about this before, when I had my researcher study the narrative that Michelle Phan is telling, because she is effective because she is a storyteller, the narrative could be mapped absolutely the same as the narrative of a disconnected human being that she's never met named Gary Vaynerchuk, who you know from the Wine Library. But he told a story, and he told a story that enabled people, everyday people, to afford great wine and to have the same value, kind of like a Sam Walton type of thing. And I think Michelle has her own quest that she's telling. But here's the point. You got to choose one and go with it. Every great movie, every great book has a commitment it makes to one of these. Now, sometimes you have a backstory. That's true. You can see a hero's journey where he falls in love along the way, but the great storyteller never lets the backstory crush the front story because people are not wired to consider hybrids. See, you got movies out there that defy what I just told you, say like Jump Cut, Pulp Fiction, but in fact, Pulp Fiction was not Jump Cut. That establishing scene that begins the movie was the most effective decision he could have possibly made to tell us everything we need to know about the purpose of that movie. So really think about that in storytelling. Pick one, do it well. If you've got to diversify it, that's fine, but don't attempt hybrid storytelling because then you lose the human advantage of the audience knowing where the story's going. You will confuse them every time. So I really want to build a little bit on what Jacob talked about yesterday and the fantastic quote he shared from John Steinbeck about our story. Everything else is forgotten. He's absolutely correct. So I did a thing with Stanford when I was at Yahoo where we were deconstructing story science and looking at viral coefficient, right? Because a viral video is merely a story that spreads faster than it decays. So the best way to produce a viral video, which you can't do on command, the best way to try and do it is to try and tell a story that creates connectedness with the viewer. That's the number one way to do it. Even if it's a cat story, all the alpha spreaders own or love cats. So it's a connectedness issue. And what I see is that storytelling, the sources, a lot of times we tell historical stories. And historical stories are great, especially in the world of Google. You can go find them. You can embellish them, except in the world of Google, that's getting harder. And you can share them. As a matter of fact, the word story comes from historia. It comes it's sourced all the way back, to old Latin words, which comes from the accounting of the past. And then as authors and as storytellers started to tell stories that haven't happened yet, story meant lie, as in to tell an untruth. But history has been a rich source of stories, but it peters out very quickly because people usually have an interest in it, but not an emotional connection. A lot of people like to tell their story. Let me tell you the story about me. And sometimes we're very vulnerable, and we're very generous in telling the story. Sometimes we've done things that are so noble, the audience can't help but stand up and cheer. But they will forget what we said in days. All they will remember is that you were a good person, or that you were an authentic person. They are not transformed. But if you could tell our story, sharing your story in an interactive way with the intention of revealing a story inside the listener, the viewer, the reader, that story spreads like a wildfire. So I want to challenge you to think about storytelling as an interactive experience where the storyteller, in a very covert sort of way, tells the audience's story. And when you've really got the audience feels like that, much to Vonnegut's point, for the first time, I understand myself. So it's not about me saying, I found out these things about you, and I'm going to say the story about Matt. It's about me talking about a disconnected object, and he's looking at it saying, if Tim only knew my story. That's the connectedness of the our story philosophy that Steinbeck was talking about in the first place. So make your choices, but think of it as a pyramid, the ladder of progression. This is an interesting philosophy in communication. And it started out with Dr. Don Broadbent at University of London. And what he studied was what's called Broadbent filter, because any great professor names their discovery after themselves. So Broadbent's filter says that human beings are constantly evolving, and that we also have defensive mechanisms when we face conditions that create stress. Because except for chemical stress, regular stress is created when those shock absorbers wear thin. That's why information overload is the leading cause of workplace stress. Department of Labor says it's $45 billion of lost productivity every year. And what Dr. Broadbent says is that there is a filter we create to not see or hear information, to disbelieve it upon presentation, and to flush it out of our RAM, the conscious memory, to make room for the new. And he predicted in the 1950s that as information demands increase for the human filter will become so dense. And he talked about this ladder of progression where you're trying to help someone understand something new and reveal a truth to him. He said at the bottom of the ladder of the progression are the statistics and the facts and the figures. As you move up the ladder to the stories that are visual and impactful, that combine sight, sound, and motion, you achieve the pinnacle. And he says you hijack the person's filter by reaching that little part of the brain that Dr. Daniel Goleman calls the amygdala in emotional intelligence. That part of the brain that is 35 times more powerful than the logical brain. And through storytelling, we climb that ladder, get them to suspend belief, and we convince people to see things our way. One of the most important things that I've thought about, though, in storytelling is about the myths of creativity. I'm going to give my email at the end of this, and I've created a book list, because those of you that know Love is the Killer app know my philosophy is that readers are leaders. And if you're interested in the subject, don't just read a blog post on it. That's fast food. Pour yourself into a book and try to deeply understand the concept. And there's a great book called The Myths of Creativity, The Myth of Genius. It's by Dr. David Burkus. And he factually disproves many of the myths we hold. One of the myths is divine inspiration. Doesn't happen. Everything that we do creatively was already in our head. We made a novel association. Creativity, he learned, is really about collaboration and research. But what I learned in a conversation with Ed Catmull from Pixar is there's no lone storyteller. It's a myth. It's a lie, usually written by people at the end of their life to say, yes, an apple fell on my head, and I made this discovery, when in fact every single one of them had a team around them, collaborating, iterating, giving them feedback, improving their stories. I met Ed Catmull at a conference we spoke at Disney a few years ago, and I got to say I was starstruck, and you would be too, because, I mean, Pixar is an incredible company. And Catmull and Lasseter and all that gang, they were brilliant people. They solved so many technology problems, brought so much joy into their life, but for me, Toy Story was a miracle. I mean, in my mind, if I had to name the greatest movies in history for me, it's like Wizard of Oz, Toy Story, Blue Velvet. I mean, and my son and I saw all of them when he was very little. And don't you look at me. And anyway, I really liked Toy Story because it was a miracle. It appealed to me as an adult and my kid. It told a story. It made me cry. They made it in a computer. They humanized the inhuman. It was such a miraculous story, though. If you looked at the plot of Toy Story, it was just beautiful. And I'm just gushing backstage, and I go, man, Lasseter is just a genius. What a brilliant story. And he said, man, that story just sucked when we first wrote it. He said, we shut down the production about 6 months in because the story wasn't right. Every time we got notes, we realized we weren't moving the audience. We weren't going to make it. He said, I had to put a team around it. They have this kind of think tank there that gets together and kind of collectively helps improve the story. He said, Tim, never forget this. Toy Story was 1,000 problems solved. And it starts with finding the problem. Let's make a movie in a computer that's so emotional people will laugh and cry. That's a really hard problem. And they had to solve it iteratively. Story design, storytelling, digital technology, rendering innovations, casting solutions, distribution issues. He said what you saw was not a miracle, it was a collaboration, and all storytelling ends up being that same type of collaboration. And that's a huge takeaway. Don't go down alone. If your story doesn't ring true, get some help. This is the last thing I really want to talk about this, how it kind of ties into digital. When I think of digital, though, I don't just think of digital media. I think about the vaporization of the physical to create the virtual. Taking the heavy, the slow, and the expensive and making it zeros and ones where transmission is too cheap to meter. That's what I think of digital as. Think about your smartphone. Your smartphone has vaporized dozens of gadgets. I have a bucket of gadgets I keep to remind me of the impact of digital. Whether it's my guitar tuner, that navigator I spent $350 on 4 years ago before an app came out and gave it to me free, all that stuff. That's what digital to me is. So you've got the cloud. The cloud dramatically reduces your cost of almost everything you're going to do. You've got, in the cloud, by the way, think about Wattpad, that fantastic storytelling technology that allows people to tell their story. You've got the crowd. You can source your stories. You can vet your stories, just like Lupe Fiasco, the rapper, wrote his last novel over Twitter, and he used the crowd to help understand what worked and where he should go. You can get the proof inside the stories on digital because all the information's there, thanks to companies like Google. Your story can be told anytime, anywhere, and that's why digital will overtake analog in every medium, yes, including video storytelling. And I believe in the future, because of hologram technology, it's going to be as good as being there, if not better. I've been using a lot of this in the production of our show, Expand. We've been working on producing a show, daytime show, tells a story about a young man who's trying to save his toy company from the future, and the future is digital. And it's a story about good versus evil. Good digital, companies that make addictive games with no purpose, and meaningful digital. Digital that improves our lives and enriches our consciousness. And I believe that storytelling was the way to do it. Not a seminar of me talking for 2 hours on a stage, but a story with actors and a DJ and dancers and tumblers and an arc to the story. And that's something we're going to approach as we produce this. And I appreciate all the great feedback you've given me. I am at Sanders Says everywhere, and this is how you can reach me. I want to finish with a quote in context. A lot of us talk about Margaret Mead. We use the Margaret Mead quote. You've heard a lot, right? Never underestimate the power of a few individuals to change the world. In fact, nothing else has. Let's finish the quote. By telling stories. Because the few harness the many and move mountains with stories. And never forget that. And that's why one person working collaboratively has the power to change the world. Thank you, guys. Thank you.